Let's begin by understanding what psychology is and a little bit of background behind psychology. If I were to ask you what is psychology, what might you be saying? Perhaps trying to understand other person's thoughts, or trying to solve problems or helping others. Well, but psychology in simple terms is the scientific study of human mind, human behavior, and their thought processes, the mind. So this definition was not an easy one to come to. Different schools of thoughts contribute to this particular definition that we know of now on psychology. The schools of thoughts are such as this, beginning from structural functionalism to Freudian psychology, and then to behavioral, and then to cognitive psychology. You will see that even before structuralism and functionalism came about, you may be aware of Greek philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, or European philosophers and French philosophers like Descartes. They were people who actually started thinking about mind-body relationship or nature-nurture aspects even before, way ahead of time than any of the psychologists ever did. But the philosophical aspect of it, we're not going to get into that, but it's important to know that that was already existing and in writing before these psychologists started experimenting. But the only difference, though, is that these researchers started to see something that was more objective, more like where you can experiment and find things. But the philosophers had a difficulty substantiating their thoughts because it was not something, part of it was that it was not easily measurable, or to validate it was kind of hard. So let's begin first exploring structuralism. Structuralism uses a method called introspection. Then that was the same time when periodic table came about. So in chemistry, so the person who actually researched on was Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German psychologist, some German researcher who was the first person to establish a psychological laboratory in Germany in 1800s, and his work primarily focused on understanding consciousness. So because it was very much informed by what was happening at the time in chemistry in terms of periodic table, they started seeing brain and the mind in terms of elements. So element structures that contributes to the consciousness, they were researching on that. So they used a method called introspection, which was primarily where they would bring participants in for the research. They would ask them to read a certain a page in a book, or describe a color, or they would ask them to solve a math problem. So as they are doing it, they would try to ask them questions to describe it. They would try to put those things together to see sensations. How were they able to describe it? Even at that time was the concept of reaction time, which because of physics, there are instruments to measure reaction time. So Wilhelm would also try to see what is the reaction time of how long it takes for people to describe a particular sensation. And Edward Titchener was his student, who later on in life moved to the US and had a laboratory in Cornell University. So he was another one who almost came up with 40,000 types of sensation using sight or sound and hearing. So we will talk about sensation perception in the coming modules, but it's important to know that this was more rigorous and scientific in nature, using these methods. And structuralism was the first approach that started validating psychology as science, because it was trying to objectify and quantify it, right? So in their effort, they found that all of the things that they were learning about mind was not just the unconscious, not just the conscious, because when you ask a person who was solving a math problem of how they did it or why they did it, it was not everyone who were participating in the research were able to explain things in a way which was explainable by conscious mind. So there came a stance when they started to realize probably there's more to consciousness than what they actually knew. So there came about another school of thought called functionalism. Functionalism, more so influenced by evolution, the theory of natural selection by Darwin, which was what was happening at that time. They were more so influenced by the prediction and that selection theory of natural selection was proposing, which was that you understand the ancestors and see their physiological adaptations or their fitting in order to understand why a person or why a particular animal has developed a certain characteristic. So they used the same explanation to understand human brain, because human brain is a complex idea for them, which they were trying to understand at the time without having a context. So they used the same idea of like how you would study a fossil, which was not that easy because it's easier to study a fossil and kind of make predictions of the physiology of an animal. But it was different when you're trying to predict and see what the ancestors' psychological characteristics were or were not based on the fossils. It wasn't easy. So although they had logical explanation in evolutionary psychology, their predictions were extremely hard to test or to objectify or to quantify. So this one was more so at that next phase where William James, who was an American psychologist, he was the first person who established a laboratory in Harvard University. He did extensive research in the area of functionalism to see what functions the human brain take because of where they are to understand human behavior a little better. So you will see that most of structuralism and functionalism both focused on the mind. But as structuralists kind of realized it in the end that not everything could be explained by consciousness, Freud at that time came about with an explanation that, yeah, you cannot explain everything by just understanding the conscious part of your mind, because so much is underneath which is unconscious. So Freud gave concepts like unconscious mind, childhood experiences. He heavily focused on childhood experiences, and anything that we know so far about psychology, probably through the media, is all person lying on the couch and a therapist behind asking questions, hypnotizing the person, taking them to a trance state. Those are Freudian approach. So that's what is called psychoanalysis. There were other people who came about after that, Erikson, Carl Jung. They kind of worked on that same psychodynamic approach, but more so focusing on the childhood experiences, which even until today holds good. And although a lot of this emphasis was on sexual aspect of it, which we do not heavily focus on as when we are trying to go to the causal aspect of disorders. We don't necessarily focus as much as how Freud did. But yeah, his theory was very significant in understanding the psychology which we have today. So after Freud proposed his unconscious aspect of human understanding, there came another field of study, or the school of thought, which was called behaviorism. So John Watson was the guy who's considered to be the father of behaviorism. He suggested that, think of mind as a box, right? So so far, structuralists and functionalists said you have to understand what goes on inside the box, which is an empty box. Try to understand what goes inside first, is what they said. But behaviorists said you don't have to understand what goes inside the mind. That's the last thing you ever need to know. Just know what goes inside and what comes out. If you can make the prediction of what comes out based on what is given, what is inputted in, that's enough to understand human mind, human brain, and psychology is what they said. So basically what it is the stimulus and the response, this, if that's the mind or the box, which they said, was the entire idea of psychology for them. So they gave a lot of laws of learning, which we will talk about in module 3, is that that we learn through association, we learn through making connections of or operations of functions. That Skinner did. He researched using pigeon. Pavlov researched using dog, kind of helped in understanding learning concepts better. These are like applications that we will see all the time in education department, where we are trying to understand how to discipline a child, giving timeout, using tokens. All those are approaches that stemmed from behaviorism. So it's very important to understand more of that, and we'll talk about it. But know that this was the first time that people started seeing behavior as also one of the major aspects of psychology. But the downfall here, by now that you would have understood, is that behaviorists heavily focused on the behavior aspect of psychology and discounted the mind, or completely discounted the mind. So there came another approach by late 1960s, which focused on understanding thinking, thoughts, and then they said, well, it's like computer, like what you put in, and understanding the thoughts influences the behavior. So when people started comparing the brain with the computer's brain, and started seeing like how, for example, memory, you store things in and organize it in categories in the cabinets, and then if you don't use it for a long time, what happens in a computer? The same thing happens in the brain. So when they started making the connections, a lot of cognitive approaches came about. And with advancement in technology, people started using neuroimaging techniques, MRI, fMRI, like as you do an activity to see what kind of functions happen in the brain. All those helped a lot in developing psychology to what it is today. So here we do understand all this. This is to just give you a review of all that we covered. Beginning, we did start from Greek philosophers, but then came to structuralism and functionalism, then moving to Freudian approach, behaviorism, and then we didn't very much talk about humanistic, but that focuses on feelings and emotions, and cognitive psychology that kind of compares brain to computer brain. So all this is what leads us to the definition called the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. Well, you may be wondering now that you are probably not a psychology major, and some of you may be, and you do know that it takes a lot to get to where you call yourself a psychologist. But then my challenge is for you to know that all these ideas, the background, is something that's so important for you, even if you're not going to pursue this field. It's important. I believe it's important because of the application it has in different fields. So the application of psychology in different fields such as healthcare, law, in engineering, in computers, in politics, in art, fashion, any type of science, all the areas that you can think of, education, all the areas you can think of, there is so much that you can learn and use the concepts of psychology. That is what I would encourage you to do. See if you can work on, reflect on that before the next time we meet. If you can start thinking about what is the branch of study you're interested in. Like it could be sports. Explore sports psychology. It could be physical therapy or exercise science, athletic training. Just explore a little bit more on sports psychology and rehabilitation psychology. If you are interested in children, look into child psychology, clinical work, hospital, doctor, whatever that you are interested in pursuing biology. Explore clinical psychology and see what that is about. Because all the learning that happens there could be something that could be used in the area of study that you are interested in. If you're someone who is interested in being a cop or trying to explore a little bit of criminal side, like CSI, Criminal Minds, focus on forensic science. Forensic psychology. So focus on that, explore, write about it. Do not just copy things. Make sure that you are personalizing it, synthesizing the material. Once you do that, add that to the discussion notes that you are keeping. Remember to put the dates. All right. Hopefully, this gave you a little bit background of what psychology is. Have a good day.